Well, good evening. My name is David Smith. I teach in the history department here at Baylor, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the 24th annual Laura Jackson Lecture in World Affairs. This is a series that brings to campus once a year some insightful, wise experts in foreign policy, in the place of America in the world and the way the world works. And it never ceases to be an evening that leaves you looking at the world differently and understanding it in a much more profound way than when you came in the room. And this year will be no exception, certainly. First of all, I have the privilege of introducing Tommy Lou Davis, Associate Professor of Classics and Master Teacher here at Baylor, who will offer our invocation.
Would you pray with me? Almighty and everlasting Father, thank you for this day and for all the blessings that you have brought our way, not only this day, but over the years. We thank you for Baylor University and for the richness of the relationships that we have gleaned from this place, and we thank you for all that it has meant to everyone in this room. Heavenly Father, we pray that you would bless those that are here. Thank you for bringing us our speaker. And tonight we're especially grateful, Lord, for the life and the memory of our dear friend, Laura Jackson. We just have such fond memories of her engaging personality, the warmth of her spirit, the love for this campus, and especially for you. And we thank you for the impact that she had on our lives. We're also thankful that the legacy and memory of Laura live on due to the generosity of her parents, Frank and Darba Jackson. We would ask you tonight, Lord, to open our hearts and open our minds to the issues that are facing us around the world. We pray for those in this country that have suffered due to storms, due to violence, and around the world due to earthquakes and violence. Just comfort, be with them, provide them with your peace. Lord, may this night glorify you. We lift it up to you, and we ask all these things in the precious holy name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus. Amen.
As Vice President of Kappa Kappa Gamma, it is my honor to welcome you to the annual Laura Jackson Lecture. I'd like to express my gratitude to Frank and Darba Jackson, Laura's parents, for making this event possible. Laura was an outstanding and respected member of the Baylor community who gave much of her time to activities and organizations on campus. It is with joy that we remember her tonight. At this time, I would like to recognize some of the special people here who are with us tonight. If you could please stand when I call your names. Laura's parents, Frank and Darba Jackson. Friends of the Jackson family who have traveled from out of town to be with us this evening. Thank you. And finally, all of Laura's Kappa sisters. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
I've been involved with this lecture since 2004 and have met a great number of people and have had the privilege of introducing a few of them. Our guest tonight, I think, is one of the most distinguished Jackson lectures we've ever had. And that's saying quite a lot. We've had quite a number of very distinguished people. Over his career, George Walden has been a diplomat, a politician, a journalist, and an author. He has seen the world, and he has brought back with him a treasure of experience, perspective, and wisdom, some of which he will be sharing with us tonight. He began his education in London, and from there went on to study at Cambridge. After that, you may have run into him furthering his education in Moscow, Hong Kong, Paris, and at Harvard. He joined the British Foreign Office in 1962 as a researcher, and it was from that position that he was sent to Hong Kong, at which point his career begins to resemble that of a host of one of those international travel shows on television. After Hong Kong, he was posted to Beijing, where he had a front row view of the tragedy and the devastation wrought by the Cultural Revolution in that country. After that, he came back to London and he manned the Soviet desk in the Foreign Office, and from there he went to the British Embassy in Paris. His diplomatic service culminated in his serving as the principal private secretary to Lord Carrington, who was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Secretary of State. He himself was elected to Parliament in 1983, rising to become the Minister for Higher Education in Thatcher's government. He was re-elected in 1987 and in 1992, and he retired from Parliament in 1997. As a writer, he contributed a column to the Evening Standard from 1991 to 2002, drawing on his wealth of experience. And he's also written for the London Times, other media outlets, and he chaired the committee that awards the British and the Russian Booker Prizes for fiction. Once he himself started writing books, he apparently never ran out of ideas, publishing acclaimed works on a wide variety of topics, including a memoir in 1999 called Lucky George, shades of Kingsley Amis and Lucky Jim perhaps, that I'm really, really looking forward to reading. He has a wonderful way of titles. He has written The Shoe Black and the Sovereign, Reflections on Ethics and Foreign Policy, We Should Know Better, Solving the Education Crisis, which it strikes me we should all perhaps read, The New Elites, Making a Career in the Masses, Who's a Dandy, on Dandyism and Beau Brummel, a character that I just looked up today and am fascinated by, Time to Immigrate, with a question mark at the end of it, and recently, China, a Wolf in the World, with another question mark at the end of it. Since 1970, he's been married to the accomplished art historian Sarah Walden, whom we're very pleased and honored to have with us tonight as well. So please join me in welcoming to Baylor, to Waco, and to Texas, all the way from London, our 24th Jackson lecturer, George Walden.
Good evening. I'd like to start by saying that I'm very honored to be invited to address this distinguished university in such imposing surroundings. In fact, slightly intimidating. You know, you feel, God, I hope this text lives up to the building, because you know, they say that we don't have the old-fashioned craftsmanship that they once had anymore. But all this was done, and I shown around the building earlier this afternoon. All this was done in 1950. So you've obviously got some craftsmanship going for you in America. I'm grateful for you all coming to this lecture, especially it seems to be the extended family of Laura Blanche Jackson. At one stage in my career, I was Minister for Higher Education, as you mentioned, David, in the government of Mrs. Thatcher in Britain, and being ultimately responsible in our rather centralized system in Britain for the finances as well as the administration of over 100 universities, I remember how much I envied American traditions of independence in higher education. And as far as I can tell from what I've heard of her, Blanche Jackson was a fine example of how gifted and dynamic personalities, free from cramping governmental oversight, can contribute to the lives of such institutions. And as I say, it's a fine thing to see her family, so many of her family here tonight. Now, the first point I'd like to make concerns the velocity of our lives. Surveying world events through the dramatizing lens of rolling news coverage, it's easy to gain the impression that things are happening faster than in the past. Has history speeded up? In one major field, relations between East and West, between America and Europe, in the West and Russia and China in the East, this is not an illusion. This quickening of events is something we have seen in our lifetimes. In Soviet Russia, communism did not wither and expire over several decades. It did better than that. It died overnight. Long-time students of communism, like myself, felt almost affronted. All those books and articles and diplomatic reports, a few of them drafted by me, had explained that the power and ideology of the Kremlin and the Chinese leadership were deeply rooted and would take time to change. And we were wrong. In a year or two, Russia ditched its totalitarian system, and the Chinese found a way, incredibly, to combine Marxism, Leninism with capitalism. But along with speeded up, turbocharged history, something else has been happening. If events of the magnitude of the Chinese and Russian transformations were taking place more rapidly than in the past, it meant that what had preceded these changes would be forgotten more quickly. The consequences of this are still with us. The fact that the Cold War ended so abruptly meant that few people under the age of 50 have much recollection of what Russian or Chinese totalitarianism were about. Younger people often have only a hazy memory of the suffering they entailed or the international conflicts that they led to. To take a simple numerical example, how many Western students today are aware that Stalin and Mao, between them, were responsible for the deaths of some 100 million people, about twice the number of victims of Adolf Hitler's war? Nor is there much incentive to look back. There is too much in the news for the average man or woman to keep abreast of, let alone to reflect on the paradoxes of the past, even if it might help us make sense of events today. The greyness and dreariness of life under communism made it an unattractive subject, and today it is decidedly out of fashion. Apart from The Lives of Others, which you remember was the 2006 film about the East German Stasi, its secret police, I am not aware of many successful films or TV programs about communism. The Nazis, meanwhile, continue to form the subject of many a play or film and to exert their unhealthy fascination. In Russia and China themselves, something similar is happening for different reasons. In Russia, bad memories of the Soviet dictatorship, abundant a decade ago, are officially discouraged, now that President Putin has decided that the treatment of Stalin had become too negative. And in China, I have heard how bored children have become about the tales their parents tell them about the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. Understandably, they prefer to live in the present. I too live in the present. When I go to China today, I don't think back to the vicious-looking Red Guards menacingly eyeing the young Englishmen prying around their streets in the Cultural Revolutionary years, reading their wall posters. That's about cool. Instead, I now look forward to a sophisticated conversation with a young Chinese journalist or writer in one of the myriad delicious Beijing restaurants, something I was never able to do in the 3 years I spent there from late 1966 to 1969. In Russia, where until recently I chaired the Russian Booker Prize for Fiction, an offshoot of the British original, I don't think back to the hounding by the KGB of students I got to know as a postgraduate in Moscow University in the early 60s. I'm too busy talking and drinking with the most literary folk on earth. But for me, it's impossible to discard the recent past. As East-West tensions persist, there are truths about these countries, their cultures, their histories, and their values that must not be forgotten, especially today when we have begun asking ourselves what it means for us that the two military giants of the East are once again in alliance against the leader of the West, the United States. The fact is that we live in an era of overabundant but unreliable information, of faster history, and of galloping amnesia. A combination not entirely suited, when you think about it, to the formation of mature national policies. There is just too much out there to ingest and to process. There is a tidal wave in human affairs in which we feel that we are perpetually on the point of drowning in events. At times like that, we must try to blank out, just for a moment, the daily distractions and focus on what mattered in the past and for the future. All the more so because we are, I believe, subject to a growing feeling that we're caught in a downturn in history, not just in the recent recession, but in international politics too. It wasn't so long ago that humanity seemed to be on the road to a Kantian dream of perpetual peace. Instead of arms races, people were talking about economic conversion as American defense industries and Soviet munitions plants retooled to produce consumer goods. In Russia, swords really were being turned into plowshares, or rather into tanks, and tanks into cars and baby carriages. On top of that, there was to be a, quote, peace dividend, unquote, for civilian use as defense budgets shrank. Intellectuals were talking seriously about the end of history as the global march of democracy quickened and East-West cooperation spread. Today, all that seems a long time ago, but it wasn't. The Berlin Wall came down a mere 28 years ago. Now the armed conflict that was avoided during the Cold War has broken out in Europe as Moscow forcibly expanded its post-Soviet frontiers to include the Crimea, seeks to re-establish suzerainty over the Ukraine, and intimidates the Baltic states. As for swords into plowshares, it is the weapons that are getting sharper, not the plows. The Russian defense budget has been increasing at 20% a year. Nor is there any talk of a peace dividend, as the US pushes its NATO allies to spend more, as it does itself, some of it on sending back troops it withdrew from Europe. As for the triumphs of democracy around the world, the Middle East is a reality check. When the strong men went in Iraq, Egypt, or Libya, or were challenged in Syria, look what happened. Worse, strong men are back in fashion in places where we like to think their grip was weakening. Watching Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, or Xi Jinping in China, toughening their grip on the minds of their peoples is dismal enough. Worse, democracy seems to be stumbling in parts of Europe and the US itself. And worst of all is the spectacle of developing countries concluding that authoritarianism is the only road to stability and that tough guys are the future. Even leaving aside terrorism, which is to leave aside rather a lot, the hopes generated in the 1990s are fading fast, fading to the point where there are people asking whether we may be worse off than before. How did we get into a world that sometimes appears more unstable than in Cold War days? Historians and commentators who tell you that it's all our own fault are to a penny, with allegations of Western incompetence, greed, insensitivity, and plain stupidity. There was never any lack of that, and there was always an element of hubris in the triumphalism of the Cold War winners. Of course there were mistakes, yet it would be another mistake to indulge in an orgy of puritanical self-reproach. As accusations of alienating Moscow or Beijing needlessly fly around, we should be careful who we listen to. Not a few of the people who chastise the West for throwing away their victory are the same ones who found an exonerating word for Mao Zedong or the brutalities of the Soviet regime, frequently under the guise of moral equivalence. It wasn't true then, and it isn't true now. The West and the Soviet Union were not equally wicked, nor is the West as guilty as Russia for the new tensions between them. I won't rehearse the arguments here, except to say that I accept that we underestimated the post-Cold War neurosis the Russians felt as their empire disappeared around them and their country shrank overnight, and that we behaved clumsily. But that is far from explaining aggressive Russian behavior today. And here we come to the crux of my argument. It is unfashionable to say so, but countries have characteristics, something like personalities. They are forged over time by their histories, cultures, and experiences. When Gorbachev was forced to dismantle the Soviet Empire, that did not mean that Russia had changed. It lost half its territory and much of its power, but its history remained what it had been, along with the qualities it had bred in its people and their leaders. The uniqueness of Russian culture we know about, as we do the heroism of its people against the Nazi menace. Yet there is another, less uplifting history. Their experience of democratic progress, confined to a few brief years at the turn of the 20th century, was brief and unproductive. Next came revolution, when the brutalizing legacy of Tsarist serfdom and autocracy were compounded by 70 years of moral and material squalor under totalitarian communism and by Hitler's ruinous invasion. What I am saying is this: when you look at the cynicism, mendacity, and official contempt for human rights characteristic of today's Russia, don't be surprised. The kleptocracy run for the benefit of its politicians, oligarchs, and secret policemen has its antecedents, as does its failure to produce an effective liberal opposition. Look at the historic failure of the anti-Bolshevik politicians in the October Revolution. And finally, as Putin casts about for foreign fall guys for his country's domestic failings, whether political or economic, don't be surprised either. Soviet Russia did the same. You can argue that Western policies and miscalculations since the war went down have helped to bring out the worst in the Russian psyche, but you cannot contend that the worst was not already there. And by worst, in essence, I mean its chronic subservience to power, the strongman syndrome. Of whom was it said that, and I quote, "He possessed all the faults of the Russian temperament, yet by the superhuman force of his will, he rendered his country a great power." There are those who contend that his very ruthlessness left an abiding legacy of nihilism, to his people. That wasn't about Vladimir Putin, though it might have been. In fact, these were the words of the British historian Harold Nicolson on Peter the Great. The present Russian leader would feel flattered by the comparison, because he does not see himself, nor should he, as a modern democratic leader, but is the latest in a line of autocratic rulers. The best way to understand Russia's historical legacy today, I believe, is to examine its president's background and personality, because in many respects he incorporates its recent past. A child of his time, for all his power and success, fundamentally he is a bitter, profoundly resentful man. From a lower middle class background, his family suffered grievously in the siege of Leningrad. An older brother died, and his parents were crippled by hunger. A proud, if undistinguished, member of the KGB, the young Putin's patriotism took a blow when the Soviet Union disintegrated around him at the age of 38, and its intelligence services briefly lost their dominating hold on Russia. As a result of these and other experiences, he has inherited many of the nationalistic barroom veracities of his countrymen. The spiritual superiority, the anti-Western grievances, justified or not, the paranoia about being surrounded, or the imminence of a liberal uprising conceived and plotted in the West. Like Peter the Great, Putin envies the West and seeks to modernize his country, but he also believes we are decadent, and when he speaks of, quotes, managed democracy, unquotes, or, quotes, Russian values, unquotes, we should read authoritarianism, personal power, and social control. In Putin's Russia, the nihilism Harold Nicolson spoke of is still there in two chief respects. One is the cynicism of his far-right intellectual backers, such as Alexander Dugin, a former self-confessed fascist, for whom postmodernism is a license for governments and their leaders to lie. It is enough to recall the Russian leader indignantly denying any connection to the tragedy of the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, a passenger flight shot down in 2014 with the aid of Russian troops, killing all 283 passengers. Or remember him denying that al-Assad, his client and head of the Syrian government, had used poison gas. These are not the routine evasions of embarrassed statesmen. Putin, a KGB man to his soul, KGB man to his soul, is genuinely indignant at such accusations, not because they are not true, but because he cannot allow the truth to be used as a weapon against himself and his country. He sees the world through the prism of his security services, where truth denial is the point. If the FSB, successor to the KGB, says it didn't happen, in Russia's parallel world, it didn't. When the German Chancellor Angela Merkel said of him that he lives in another world, this is what she was getting at, a world of institutionalized mendacity. His attempt to interfere in the US election is the latest example of Putin's nihilism. To an extent, he succeeded and humiliated his American adversaries, but at what cost? No US government can accept that it didn't happen. So sanctions have been extended, and the idea that there can be a new beginning in Russian-US relations based on mutual trust while Putin is in power has gone forever. Giving short-term intelligence coups, precedence over Russia's long-term interests is a manifestation of a small man's psyche. Something to remember when Western magazines pronounce Putin, quotes, statesman of the year, unquote. quotes. Russia's strategic nihilism shows in the destructiveness of his foreign policy. Anything that damages Western interests is fine by him, even if it does little to enhance his own. Syria is an example. People say Putin is winning, but it depends what you mean to win by winning. The idea of Russia with a GDP about the size of Italy, and where 20% of the population live below the poverty line, finding itself responsible for the reconstruction of a country destined to be dominated by terrorism and religious-based conflict for generations to come, is a curious concept of victory. To say nothing of the viciousness of the regime Russia will find itself supporting. His short-termism poses grave dangers not just for us, but for Russia itself. A combination of power projection abroad and economic failure, or at best stagnation at home, can only increase his domestic problems. Should this continue, the point may eventually come when he becomes like the man described by Nietzsche, who thinks he's leading the crowd, but when he looks round, he discovers that they're chasing him. To avoid this situation, the temptation will be for the Russian leader to maintain popularity by risky moves abroad and dramatizing Western reactions as threats to the motherland. For the West, it is as if Russian foreign policy were being run by the Russian intelligence service rather than a normal diplomatic machine, something that did not happen in the Soviet Union when the Politburo was ultimately in charge. Reaction to the Putin phenomenon in some American and European circles has been disconcerting. A troubling number of politicians or commentators who would have been seen as anti-communists in the past speak fondly of a man who in many ways is harking back to that totalitarian past. It is depressing to see Western figures expressing admiration for the Russian leader, whether it's Nigel Farage in the UK, Marine Le Pen in France, or Republicans in the USA. The fact is that Russia today is in danger of edging ever closer to the fascistic spectrum. Fascistic may sound a harsh word, yet it is hard to think of another one. In Russia we have ultranationalism, oligarchic corporatism, militarism, a leadership cult, militant youth movements, thuggish treatment of opponents, state-sponsored murder, homophobia, religious mysticism, all of this together with a revanchist mindset over the country's Cold War defeat. When we speak of the Cold War, we tend to think of the Soviet Union rather than Mao's China. Yet the global impact of liberating the energies and intelligence of over 1 billion Chinese has been far greater than that of 140 million Russians. The repercussions on the world economy affect all of us in the West, as everyone knows. Some people saw it coming. As early as 1927, the author of The Decline of the West, Oswald Spengler, wrote, and I quote, "And so presently the natives," his word, "saw into our secrets and understood them, and used them to the full. The innumerable hands of the colored races," his words again, "at least as clever and far less exigent, will shatter the economic organization of the whites to its foundation." That was in his book, or essay I think it was, Man and Technics, Oswald Spengler, 1927. Once the Chinese had sloughed off the Maoist incubus, nowhere have the truth of his words been more striking than in their country, as the Russians, who import not just most of their consumer goods from China, but high-tech items too, will have noticed. I've spoken of the importance of the personality of the Russian leader, and it is revealing to compare him with Xi Jinping. The contrast in their backgrounds is as striking as in their physical appearance. Putin, smallish, nervy, and frequently sullen, especially in Western company. Xi Jinping, large, dominant-looking, and serene. Putin is a long-term bodybuilder. We have difficulty imagining the Chinese leader being anxious about his physique. Taller than any Chinese leader for decades and imposingly corpulent, he is content to be himself. He is also, it appears, well-read: Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Voltaire, Rousseau, and many other classics. And before he became president and China's ally, Putin was not above a little racism about Eastern peoples and how Russia's underdeveloped Far Eastern regions were under long-term threat from China. I don't want to be over-dramatic, he said in a speech in Blagoveshchensk in Siberia in the year 2000, but if we don't make real efforts quickly, in a few decades, even the Russian populace will be speaking Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. That was Putin. Xi Jinping once told Putin that they had similar characters, which is true in the way they run their countries. Both are tough regimes and getting tougher, especially in controlling information. Both share a fear of instability. Putin of a Ukrainian-type uprising in Red Square this time, and Xi of anything harking back to Tiananmen Square. And in both cases, their fears are, in my view, highly exaggerated. The fact that there seems little prospect of this happening in either country is due partly to their popularity as leaders, partly to their ruthless repression of dissidents and manipulation of public opinion. We're accustomed to seeing China and Russia acting together, notably over Syria or North Korea, but there is another side. The days when China took its lead from Moscow are long gone. It is cautious about identifying itself with Russian aggressiveness in Europe, notably in the Ukraine, though it has recently joined the Russians on naval maneuvers, believe it or not, in the Baltic. The reason China agreed to these maneuvers, I strongly suspect, had more to do with the situation in the South China Sea and the Pacific, where China resents the increasing US presence. What Sweden, Denmark, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania think as they watch the Chinese Navy exercising off their shores would be interesting to know. Globally, it would be safe to say that the Chinese leader is more respected than that of Russia. Recently, Xi Jinping scored a plus over Putin that has been insufficiently noticed. Moscow's policy of seeking to incline the US election in Donald Trump's favor, only to be reduced to blustering about American Russophobia when it was caught out, lacked dignity, to put it mildly. Compare Xi Jinping's cool and composed reactions during the US election campaign. He didn't scream and shout when China was threatened by Donald Trump with the revision of the US one-China policy or a trade war with Washington. He waited in dignified silence, came to see the newly elected president, and though policy issues remain, not least North Korea, trade, or the South China Sea problem, he impressed US and world opinion. In fact, in my view again, he has impressed a little too much. As American prestige in the world subsides, temporarily I very much hope, China's is beginning to rise unrealistically high. China has become the, quotes, global grown-up, claimed the front cover of The Economist magazine recently. Beijing would now be seen, quotes, as the linchpin of global economic stability, said Newsweek. To suggest that Xi Jinping is the new champion of the, quotes, liberal world order, unquotes, as I've also seen done, is to overlook his human rights abuses so long as he delivers rhetorically on climate change and other matters. That, in my view, would be a mistake. The best that one can say of it is that it's better than suggesting that the world's guardian angel is henceforth Vladimir Putin. We must never forget the plight of the millions of Chinese subjects whose human rights continues to be denied. These pressures are one reason for the remarkable resurgence of religion, Protestantism and Catholicism, as well as Buddhism, Taoism and Islam. Current projections suggest that China could overtake the United States as the world's largest Christian community by the 2040s. Meanwhile, there can be no denying that in our relations with both Russia and China, these are uneasy times. In gloomy moments, some wonder we were not better off in the old Cold War after all. We remember the tensions and dangers and forget the upsides. Those were the days, remember, when the West faced no economic competition from the communist East at all, when the talents of able, educated Chinese, Russians, Czechs or Poles were stymied by the communist system. Then there was a kind of stability. In Russia, we faced a formidable but disciplined adversary with a prudent collective leadership. Today, there is no Politburo, no row of stolid bureaucrats in Homburgs in the Kremlin, only Putin and his cronies, which in effect means that the intelligence services are in charge. And they know it. A recent head of the FSB, Patrushev, said it had become, quotes, our new nobility, unquotes. And most recently, Putin has seen fit to allow a new statue to commemorate the bloodiest of all Soviet heads of the secret police, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Cheka. So much for what the West is up against. In the British Foreign Office, that discouraged hand-wringing and endless analysis by diplomats, papers for ministers had to take a prearranged three-part format: problem, background, and recommendation. So I find it hard to conclude my remarks without my view of what should be done. To begin with the basics, people talk increasingly about how the old diplomatic patterns are breaking up, like so much Arctic ice, and how we should learn to work within a multipolar world. Of course there is truth in that, but I would urge caution. Whatever our view of Donald Trump, I don't believe we should abandon hope of America's preeminent role continuing alongside Europe as leaders of the international liberal system. Of course we must face realities of a changing world, but those decrying American global leadership in favor of new poles of power and influence should remind themselves of what these poles consist of. One is a revanchist Russia. Another is an increasingly domineering China, which appears to be reverting to a tributary system towards its neighbors. Then there's the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and now a troubling Turkey. Unstable, often corrupt African regimes, and increasingly unsteady South America. One thing you can say about these new poles of power is that they are mostly poles apart from Western ideals. In such a world, the weight of responsibility on the US and her allies does not diminish, it grows, as does the need to project and to protect and uphold what we have in common. On policy towards Putin's Russia, the sad truth is that we are going to have to soldier on where we left off in the early 90s. In many respects, the Cold War is back, and there are moments, the Ukraine is one, when it can seem warmer than before. Let me give a single instance of the new virulence of Russian propaganda. Some months ago, when the film Dunkirk was launched, the Russian embassy in London jeered at it as celebrating British cowardice in 1940, when British troops had to be withdrawn from France. I have no need to remind anyone in this room that Stalin was in alliance with Adolf Hitler at the time. If Putin wants to take his country back to the 1980s, he will drag us back with him. While he and his circle are in power, no one will be able to say, as Mrs. Thatcher said of Gorbachev, that here was someone with whom she could do business. Doing business means having a degree of mutual trust, and I would recommend against trusting a man with an unreconstructed KGB mindset. Soldiering on, as before, is not a recipe for mutual isolation. Now as then, we must continue to engage with Moscow on all fronts: diplomacy, trade, contacts, culture, though without the slightest delusion. For us, its outward changes, for all its outward changes, in essence, our adversary, there's no other word, is the same country as before, somewhat richer, somewhat freer, but a country whose people remain ultimately submissive to a corrupt, repressive power. We must not fool ourselves. There is no serious constituency for regime change in Russia, and if we continue to pretend that Putin can be a reliable partner, the day change might finally come will be further delayed. History shows that internal change only comes when Russia has exhausted all the alternatives. If there is any hope for optimism, it is there. As for China, the position is more paradoxical. Everyone is in favor of democratic change, and we should continue to register our opposition to a reinforcement of Communist Party rule. We should also remain vigilant over indications that Deng Xiaoping's policy of, quotes, the peaceful rise of China is turning into a more bullying attitude or an expansionist one, as in the South China Sea, and react with measured firmness. Since I am no longer in public service, I'm allowed a personal word to conclude. If my analysis of Russia or China sounds a little harsh, you can put some of it down to my private disappointment with the way the post-Cold War period has developed, especially Russia. Shortly after the wall fell, I went back to Moscow to address some students. I found them exhilarated, open-minded, anxious to travel and learn and to exploit their new freedoms. That is no longer my impression, either for the young or the old. In China, until a few years ago, there was a hope that the process of opening the country up would gather pace during the second half of Xi Jinping's tenure. That hope has now been abandoned, as Xi has made it clear that he has no interest in encouraging either multi-party democracy or Western values. What I see now in both Russia and China is the steady rise of nationalism. And the worst way to counter that is for the West to indulge in new forms of nationalism itself, because the effect can only be to weaken our solidarity. As someone who has worked for many years with our American allies and who retains my faith in this country, I don't want to see that happen. Thank you all for coming and for your attention tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Walden has graciously offered to field any questions that you might have.
No, I don't think so. You're maybe being a little too truthful. I don't think in general excess delicacy works, certainly not with the Russians. and with the Chinese too, but slipping back into a realistic diplomatic mode. I would go a little bit easier on the Chinese for a number of reasons. First of all, there is absolutely no prospect of working democracy coming soon to China. I think that's just, it's not something one wants to go about saying too loudly because we all hope for the best. I just don't see it in the numbers, leaving aside everything else. If China, under any sort of sudden democratic strains, if you could imagine a sudden transition to democracy in China, would break up. Because historically that there are precedents. And they're simply not prepared for it. I mentioned Russia with no democratic background to speak of, aside from a few years in the early 20th century. China even less. So whenever making these, what you're talking about in a way, diplomatic judgments, you have to have at the basis of your calculation the facts of the matter.
What is your assessment of the participation in the United Nations? How does that play a role? Is that just a perfunctory exercise that we're watching before us, or is there some element of potential play?
Well, looking at recent experience of, I'm sorry again, but the Russians and Chinese stymieing year after year the United Nations on Syria, you might sometimes wonder. But my brief answer is that it's all we've got. So you've got to keep going. So here I sympathize with American policy because to have this sort of performance going on, and often I'm afraid it is a performance, look at the human rights delegations and who compose them, etc. I sympathize with people who say, why do we go on? But, you know, it's the old World War II joke, what other hole is there to go to?
The end of the Cold War was largely attributed to both Margaret Thatcher's actions and that of President Reagan's back in the late 80s. Can you compare and contrast what you think would have been the three successful things that ended the Cold War then, and then attribute that to modern-day policy in terms of how you see those two countries acting going forward today?
You raise a very important point about the President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And let me tell you an anecdote by way of reply that I was working at that time. You're referring, I think, to the loud accusations by Thatcher and Reagan against the empire of evil and so on in those years. We actually know now, we know this for a fact, the diplomatic records, because the Russians did actually release some records, that the then Soviet government was seriously worried that the West was contemplating or building up to a first nuclear strike. This wasn't propaganda. We know that some people inside the Soviet regime were seriously afraid, and we also know from a particular Russian defector to a very high-level defector to Britain, who was actually resident, believe it or not, in the Soviet embassy in London before he defected, that they were at the point of sending out some of their operatives every night to Whitehall to see whether the lights were on late at night. That was the level, as well as other measures, that they were seriously concerned. And so when I stopped working for Lord Carrington, he had to resign because of the Falklands crisis. He went off to NATO and he had to give a speech. And he asked me to draft it, so I drafted the speech. And I felt at the time that I was all in favor of toughness with Russia, and no nonsense. But these are very delicate matters, as we're being reminded today, I hope, with North Korea talking about nuclear warfare should not be done lightly. And so I put in this speech for my former boss, Lord Carrington, to give to NATO, that we should be wary of what I called megaphone diplomacy. And he read this speech and approved everything except this phrase, which he didn't pronounce in the speech, but it had gone out in a pre-released version to the press. So that is how the phrase megaphone diplomacy came into being, without it ever being pronounced. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a long way around to saying I sympathize in spirit. I don't believe in blathering off the top of one's head. And Reagan, subsequently, when shown this intelligence, that actually the Russians were seriously worried by the things he was saying, into thinking that America was preparing a first strike, toned it down. He was not a stupid man, President Reagan. And so I think there's a message there for us all today. We should be careful what we say. People in authority, I'm allowed to say anything. Yes.
Can I ask you a brief level of religion? You mentioned about Russia. Two things. One is the sort of mystical thing. The other one you mentioned is spiritual pride. I forget religion or religious touch. It's a feature of some of the threats that they are connected to the other side of the ship. So in the Atlantic world, we look back to the end of the by the Allies in the First World War. China's a different story, so I just want to put that on the side. Russia's censorship and defeat, particularly as it sees itself as a European country. I think particularly in relation to Ukraine, we hear as extremely important, we know the history of Russia's sense of its religious identity, its second world history, and all the rest of it. Do you think, first of all, that we have a desire here for these spiritual problems coming in? And secondly, do you see religion in Russia, in this culture, idioms of Russia, as part of it?
Well, yes, as you speak, I'm reminded of a fact that lodged in my mind when I was reading a new biography of Peter the Great, which actually went back to 17th century Russia, about how backward it was. There were, I think it was 14 books were published in Moscow in the early 17th century, all of them on religion. Quite interesting when you think of what was being published in the West. This was a deeply backward country, and part of its backwardness was in the sort of feudalism which was buoyed by the Russian Slavonic Church, way past the 15th century, 16th and onwards, you know. So seriously bad. And then to look at the way the church behaved under, well, of course, was treated, the murderous extermination of Christianity by the Soviets. But then subsequently, you know, there were people who worked with Stalin and so on in the church. And then the less than impressive conduct of the church today, and what they say about Putin being a new savior and so on. What I'm trying to say is that none of this strikes me as spiritual thinking of the sort that one has respect for. And so part of the danger of the new Russia, I think, is this this essentially backward power worshipping history of religion in Russia, which makes one worried for the future. Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
So we've seen the United States interact with states like China and Russia on fronts like Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea, Vietnam, and war. What kind of mistakes did the United States make during those times when it was dealing with China and Russia at that time? And how do we, as the United States, in alliance with Europe, avoid this?
Well, actually, just before I forget, the word I was groping for talking about Russian religion is obscurantist. It's an obscurantist religion. Not a good thing to be, seems to me. As distinct from, speaking broadly here, other more thoughtful religions. Yes, the mistakes, well, there are a lot of mistakes. And actually, I go back to your question again here. The West, I think I said in the speech, didn't have the imagination, seemed to me, to see what an appalling defeat the end of the Cold War was for them, the suddenness, the horror of it from Russia's point of view. We should have been more imaginative, and so this comes into the Ukraine, when it doesn't matter, in a sense, what we think of the moment. We should remember what Kiev means for Russia, historically. And so, to put it brutally, the woman, in my view rather farcically, who at the time was supposed to be the sort of British woman, foreign minister of the European Union, felt very proud of herself in the, what was it called, the square in Ukraine, where all the action was happening, strutting up and down there. But I don't think she had any idea, or no one had told her, that actually the ties between Ukraine and Russia go back quite a long way to the very notion and centrality of Christianity in Kiev, what it means to Russian spiritual tradition and so on. So you have to take account of all that, even though you disapprove of Putin's behavior. That goes, and that's important because in the same way, I think, and here this is a more contentious point, I don't think that the Ukraine has every right to be a member of NATO. Of course they have. They're an independent country. On the other hand, given what the Ukraine is politically and economically, i.e. a very large country, where are we, 45 million people, the most backward politically, right, with a shocking record, collaboration with Nazi during the Second World War, anti-Semitism, and economically politically the most backward, and economically one of the poorest record in Europe. You want to be a little bit careful about what you're taking on, particularly if the effect is to sort of, knowing that you're dealing with a deeply wounded ally, do you want to poke it in the other eye? Poke it in one. And so these were all, I think, mistakes by the West. This wasn't a time to say, to make things tougher for Russia when we'd already won. So I think there was put it gently, a lack of finesse in our treatment. But I must stress that of course they have the right, but look, Hong Kong has the right, the people of Hong Kong, highly educated people, only 7 million of them, but they're a pretty smart bunch of people, they have every right to be independent. Of course they have. And certainly they have every right for democracy, right? But they can't possibly have it. It's out of the question, right? I mean, in real life diplomacy, I mean, you can stand up and say they have the right. It isn't going to happen. It can't happen. China won't allow it to happen. They'll just take it over tomorrow. well, they're taking it already. But do you see the point I'm making? That things that people have a right to sometimes cannot be achieved. The whole Chinese people has a right to democracy, but that is not going to happen. And if we were to, in some way, try to force it to happen, a lot of people would die. And the same in the Ukraine. Of course they have a right to be members of the European Union. Of course they have a right to be members of NATO if they want. But implementing that right could be highly dangerous. So I think we've backed away from that now, in my view rightly, but we shouldn't have pushed forward quite in the way we did. But I don't want to exculpate Putin. He is the guilty party, not us. Sorry.
You made a vote in favor of the whole yes. It was in London, it was an outlaw watching Russia during the Cold War. Thanks for our previous game of all standing. It was dangerous for Russia. Not all elections involved in labor. So very major symptoms of study of the Cold War. One upshot of that is that this same game of all standing has recently built a high-standard man in the UK. We probably know was a very outstanding Russian priest who, walking from his home, when he was trained to stop, to catch that train to his local parish, was brutally murdered.
What year was this?
You don't have to know when he was murdered.
Roughly.
It was early 90s, maybe.
All right.
Anyhow, the suspicion is done by Asian people. But you view about that murder having abuse of the because what would be the advantage of murdering a popular, powerful priest of the Orthodox Church who was not involved in that government activity at all? He was just he sees a threat and so devastated.
Well, having been perhaps rather sweepingly critical of the Orthodox Church, obviously I recognise there are lots of perfectly serious, non-corrupt people working there who are not in any way subservient to the Kremlin. I don't actually know this particular murder, but maybe this was one of the sort of people I've just described, and quite possible for some reason the authorities or someone paid by the authorities took him out. I just don't know. But sorry to say this, but disgusting things are possible in today's Russia.
You had mentioned earlier in the presentation that you and your colleagues were very surprised by the whole Russian regime.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Surprised by...
You had mentioned earlier that you were very surprised by the fall of the Russian regime under communism. What aspects have the Russians presented to you and your colleagues when you were entrenched in that made it look like they were politically stable? And what took you by surprise, basically?
I'm sorry, I have difficulty hearing.
She said, what took you by surprise
Yes.
with the fall of the Soviet Union, and what had you observed that made you think that it was permanent,
That it was...
that it was lasting, that it wasn't?
Oh, I see. Yes, you picked, I suppose, unerringly on a slight contradiction in what I was saying, because I admit now that you've mentioned it, that having said that having said that there are certain permanent features of people, like characteristics of a personality, and that they'd always have worship for power and powerful individuals, that actually I, amongst others, failed to realize that they could, in this particular case, break away rather suddenly from communism, certainly much more sudden than I or anyone else, one or two exceptions, expected. That seems to go away from that, but then I would argue that really I was saying that it was only to sort of come back, which they're now doing, I think, to fall under the old yoke of form of serfdom in a way, which I strongly believe is a sort of permanent feature, unfortunately, of Russian life, of this sort of, together with sort of fatefulness, really. Ну что ж, you know, to hell with it, you know. There is no great support in Russia, we now know, for freedom. You know, they're against it. They think it means anarchism. You know? And so you're right. There is a slight contradiction, but I'm afraid this is my real point, that they're falling back under the anarchistic, that they don't want to build democracy as we know it. There's no huge, overwhelming force supporting that in Russia.
Do we have time for you to comment about your book, God Won't Say America, Signposts of a Nation?
Well, that rose out of something that had always impressed me against the general views, particularly on the left. I've always been very impressed by the Puritans, who have often got a bad rap. So I wanted to write something saying how Puritanism had informed some of the best traditions in America and some of the less admirable. For example, women, you know, I think I'm right in saying 1627, going back to Russia, you know, where they weren't even publishing books. Here were the Puritans debating up there in Boston about women's rights and awarding women's rights, saying, you know, because the women were a partnership in the marriage, very much the thing, and actually saying a woman must have, I think actually I'm right in saying half, you know, like modern courts, half in cases of divorce, that they would get half the money, and saying they were really, not to speak of science, of course, these are really forward people. Now, at the same time, it seemed to me that, and not everyone in this room will agree with this, that there was a danger that unquestioning, unquestioning, trumpeting religion was not the way forward. And they didn't, of course some of them did, you know, they believed in witches, some of them too, but generally the tradition was extraordinarily intellectual and thoughtful, and the debates in the 17th century America were extraordinarily high quality things. And so that's not what I'm saying when I don't think that the answer for America, this is a huge statement, is simply assertions of godliness, right? But the answer is in debates about spirituality, such as the Puritans had, rather than mere, I suppose in modern terms, what is that phrase about, in Britain, sort of happy-clappy religion, i.e. non-reflective religion, or a religion which is not open to discussion and argument, hence the rather provocative title. But actually the book itself is full of, it seems to me, full of praise for much of the Puritan tradition in America.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and good night.